Welcome. Today we are going to get into Cinema4D. We're going to look at the interface and see what we can do just with the basic interface that we've got. So to start with, whenever you open Cinema4D, if there are any updates available, they will be visible in this pop-up window that shows up. Now, currently there's updates on all sorts of content libraries that are available. I have not installed any of the content libraries. These content libraries are great because, one, you'll see they're absolutely huge in size, but they include a bunch of pre-made objects, different presets for other tools, materials, all sorts of other things, and they're really great. In addition, sometimes you will see an update here that actually adjusts, that makes changes to any bugs that are in the software. Under the optional uploads, if you speak another language rather than English, which is the default here, you can select that and add a new language pack. And then it just tells you what other things you've already installed. I don't need to do any of that, so I'm just going to close this. This quick start dialog also pops up, which allows you to create a new project or open an existing project. You'll see that you have your recent projects here, and there's this one template, product design template, and then they also have short tutorials and other things listed here that you can view as well. For now, we're just going to click New, and we'll get to Cinema4D. So this is the basic interface, right? This beautiful dark gray, pleasant to look at interface. There are a few major features. First, this big window here is called the viewport. And the viewport is where you see your scene. There is a default camera. As you'll note, it says default camera here. And that allows you to view into this port. This is where all the modeling will take place. Anytime you're rotating views, setting lights, doing all of those things, it'll all take place in this window. Above that window, there is a row of icons, and these icons give you quick access to certain tools and features in Cinema4D that you're going to be using frequently, right? So over here are how you kind of navigate around within your viewport. These tell you which axes you can move in or that you've locked. These allow or deal with rendering. This next set of icons over here are basically all the tools that you use to make things. Along the far left-hand side of the screen, there is another set of icons, and these are focused on the different modes that you can model in. To start with, we will be using model mode, but you'll notice that there's points, edges, and polygons mode as well. There's also texture mode, which we'll get to later. And there's a few other settings over here, including like whether or not you want to be able to snap to a grid in 3 dimensions or not. And these ideas of work planes and where they're located and if they're locked or unlocked. We're going to leave all of that set at the default for pretty much everything. Below the window, the viewport, there is this empty gray box here. That is called the Material Manager, and when you start creating materials, you will create them in here, they will appear in here, and that's where you will access them and keep them organized. To the right of that window, there's this little box here that has an XYZ. It says world, scale, apply, H, P, and B, and some degrees in there. This, when we start creating objects, this is the coordinates manager, and it basically allows you to set the coordinates numerically and hit apply to move or rotate your object or scale it. Between the viewport and these two other boxes, there's this strip here. And this is something that, since these tutorials are going to be focused primarily on using Cinema4D as a 3D modeling program and not working with the animation features, this is like the timeline, but in like a really short, simple way. And what this does is it will allow you to set keyframes and animate things, but we're not going to be using those features in this set of tutorials. To the right side of the screen, there are 2 other big boxes. The one at the bottom is called the Attributes Manager, and the Attributes Manager anytime you have any object selected in your scene, the attributes that you can modify are exposed here. And something to note, right now I don't have any objects in the scene, and so by default the project settings pops up. And you'll notice there's a lot of settings here. This tab is highlighted in blue. If I click on this one's highlighted in yellow, and the reason it's yellow is because it had new things. There's new features or changes to features, and so anytime Cinema4D releases a new version, they highlight anywhere in yellow. They use yellow to highlight any place that a new feature has been added. If I click on these other tabs, right, I get different things that I can do, but they're all highlighted in blue. Something else I want you to note in both this window and the one above it is there are also tabs along the very edge of the screen. And I don't know if you can see that on YouTube or not, but there's attributes. If I click on this, layers and structure. Right, I'm going to go back to attributes. And then up above this, this is the object hierarchy. And so there's nothing in there because we have no objects, so that's no hierarchy. But there's a couple other options here. There's also takes, which is something that's more specific to animation. We're not going to worry so much about takes right now. And then there's the content browser. And I don't have anything installed. But if you installed the different materials packs and presets and all of that, those things would show up here, and this is where you access those to pull them into your scene. Above the object hierarchy, there are two options up here. There's this node spaces, which we're not going to deal with right now. That's a bit more of an advanced feature. And then there's the layouts button. Right now we are in the default layout, right? This is what we'll use to start with for the first few tutorials. But once we start doing polygon modeling and some other things, or maybe when we start doing 3D painting or UV editing, there are different layouts that basically reorganize the panes and bring certain tools to the front, and other tools are pushed aside so that everything that you need to, say, rig an animated figure or do sculpting or whatever is accessible, right? Because there's so many tools, and this is such a massive program that if everything was exposed at once, it would be like completely unintelligible. Already the learning curve can be pretty steep in Cinema4D, and so so one of the things they do to help with that is by breaking things into the normal. And this is under startup, but if I went to standard, it looks exactly the same. If I was to change this to sculpt, you'll see a pretty big difference. Or if I was to change this to, BP UV edit, things look a lot different as well, right? All the same tools are still available in these modes, but they're just hidden or reorganized in a way to expose the things that'll help you out. So I'm going to go back to startup. And then in order to work with the other, the very last thing I forgot to mention is at the very top of the screen, at least in the macOS version, there is a menu at the very top that has a whole bunch of options, right? There's file, edit, create, mode, select, etc., 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 etc. This allows you access to pretty much every tool. And one of the interesting things about Cinema4D is rather than have one place that you can go to do the same thing, say like to create a cube, Cinema4D has two different places you can go to do that, along with quick keys and other things that you can use, so you don't even have to go to any of the menus. And the reason they do this is they wanted it to be a program that allows you to work the way that you want to work, right? Whatever is most efficient and most effective for you. To start with, we are going to be using mainly these icons or the menus up at the top. And as we get into it, I'll show you the shortcuts as well. This way you know where these things are, because it's a visual thing, you can see them more easily. So speaking of that, let's go ahead and create an object so we can kind of start to see how we maneuver and navigate within the viewport around this object. So what we're going to do is we're going to create, well actually let's create, we'll create a cube to start with. So all you do is you go up to this icon, you click on it once, you create a cube. If with any of these icons at the anywhere, if they have a little black arrow in the corner, that means if you click and hold, it will open up a whole menu of options, right? So this is the primitives menu, right? So there's all of these are what are called primitive objects, and in the sense that there's something that you can start with. They're simple shapes that are used in a lot of different models, and it gives you some place to hit the ground running. And so we're going to start with a cube just because it's the simplest object. And so once I've got this cube set up, there's a few ways that we move around the scene. And so first, what we're going to do, rather than move the object, will actually be moving the camera around the object. And so that's the best way to think about working in 3D space on a screen, is that either you're moving your objects or you're moving the camera, right? And you can imagine like having a cube on a desk and you're walking around it and your eyes are the camera and you're examining the different sides based on that. Or you can move the cube around the surface of the desk and then it's actually moving in space. And so to start with, we're going to look at how you move around the object rather than move the object around. So to move around the object, there are a few buttons at the top of this viewport. Up here, there's these 4 options. There's one that looks like 4 arrows. There's one that looks like an arrow going in and out. There's one that looks like arrows rotating. And there's this other like cube or square within a square. So to start with, if we click on this first button and drag, right, what it does is it's moving the camera up and down and left and right, if that makes sense. I'm going to zoom out a little bit and do this again so you can see the whole window, right? So I click on this, I can move the camera left and right and up and down, and you'll see that little white cross is the center of my view, right? This second option that looks like it's going in and out is zoom. So if I click and drag on this, I can zoom in closer to the object or I can zoom out further away from the object. If I hold down and if I click and drag on this third option, then what it does is it rotates my view around that center point that you can see, that center cross there, right? And so now I'm rotating my view. The fourth option allows me to split this viewport into 4 separate views. So if I click on this, now I've got my perspective view, which is the default. I've also got a top view, a right view, and a front view. And these are really useful when we start to put different objects together, right? They allow you to cleanly match things up. And you'll notice the view's a little different, right? This one has filled in and shaded faces, and this is just what's called a wireframe, right? We don't see any of these flat surfaces, we just see the edges of the object. If I go up to this little menu here just above my perspective view and I go to display, you'll see that there's this option called garage shading that is turned on. And there's several other options down here, right? Lines is one of them. If I just click on lines, you'll see that I just have this outline, the skeleton of the shape that I've got. If I change my display to garage shading lines, then I both have the lines and the shading. If I want, I can also do quick shading, which is a little bit flatter. You can't really tell with a cube, but if it's a curvilinear form, then the shadows are much simpler. And if I say quick shading lines, right, that makes sense. So constant shading in lines, that just flattens that color out completely. But basically, in certain cases, it's best to use garage shading. Sometimes it's best to be able to see all the polygons that make up the surface of the object. And so we'll be switching between those views depending on what we're doing. To get back to a singular view, you just click again on this icon that looks like the square within a square. If you want to go back to perspective view, you click on this one. If you want the top view to be the only view, you click on this one, right? So now it's top view. If I pop this back out and click on this one, then I'm back in perspective. And we're going to stay in perspective view right now. Okay, so I've showed you how to move around the objects using these buttons. Now, there's also a set of quick keys that allow you to press keys on the keyboards to do the exact same thing. And those keys are aligned in this order, and it's 1, 2, and 3. So if I hold down the number 1 on the keyboard and I click and drag, I will get that same up and down, left and right motion. If I hold down the number 2 and click and drag, I will zoom in and out on the object. If I hold down the number 3 and click and drag, I will rotate around the object. This makes things a lot faster, right? The quick keys are there because you have this one hand that's not doing anything while you have your other hand on the mouse. And it takes a lot less time to press the number 1 and click and drag than to move your mouse all the way up here, click that, and then drag it around, and then release and then move back to your model. So I highly suggest using those quick keys 1, 2, and 3. So let's look at moving our object and rotating it in things in space. Now I'm moving my view a little bit just to make this a little easier for you all to see. So first, when we're working in three-dimensional space, we're working in 3 different what are called axes. Right? We have the x-axis, which is the red axis, the z-axis, which is the blue axis, and the y-axis, which is the green upright axis. And what that means is that each one of these, right now, when I created this object, the point where all 3 of these things come together, and that's these like lighter gray, lighter colored, longer arrows, where they come together, that is called the origin. It's the center of this virtual world. And it is value 0, 0, 0. It means that it's centered along the x, y, and z axis, right? So the z-axis goes from 0 to infinity in this direction, and 0 to negative infinity in the other direction. The x-axis does the same thing along this red arrow, and the y-axis does the same thing along the green. So if I move this up a little bit, you'll see it says I've moved it 45 centimeters. And if we look down in this coordinates manager here, you'll see that my y position is 45.5 centimeters. If I hover over this green arrow again and click and drag down, it tells me how many units I've moved it there, but it also shows that I am now currently at negative 71.422 degrees, right? And so to move this, you'll notice that, right, I can click on any one of these arrows, and what that does is it locks motion in a single direction. Right? I can only go in the x direction here. I can only move it in the z here. I can only move it in the y here. If I want to move it along what's called a plane, right? So the xz plane would be essentially the ground plane in this. What I do is I hover over the little mark that's between the 2 arrows, and you'll see they both highlight. And I click and drag, and now it's moving around along the ground plane, or in this case, I could move it along the XY plane, so it goes below the ground, above the ground, left and right. These are the ways that we move this object. If I just click on the object and drag it around, it's actually moving in all 3 dimensions. I highly suggest not doing this because what happens is that when the computer is trying to figure out what you mean by moving your mouse in 2 dimensions on a table and translating that to 3 dimensions, you have no idea where that object exactly is going to end up. It tries to do an all right job, but sometimes things go in really weird places. So I suggest always only moving in 1 or maybe 2 dimensions at a time, because otherwise it's really challenging to get things to end up where you think they're going to end up. Okay, so the Move tool is selected by default. It's this icon up here of the cross with the blue background. The other 2 options, and you'll notice if I hover over this, it says Shortcut E, Shortcut T, and Shortcut R. Right, so those are my quick keys to control these things. And these are the main ways you move an object in the world. So, I mean, obviously, I guess you move, scale, or rotate an object in the world. So this is the Move tool. If I click on this one, this is the Scale tool. And with primitives, they always scale uniformly. So even though I'm only hovering over one of these objects, if I'm using the Scale tool, because it's a primitive, it's going to scale in all 3 dimensions the same amount. If I want to scale each dimension of a cube a different amount, there's these little orange dots with the line that comes down, and that allows me to scale different dimensions independently of one another, right? And so I can kind of make some larger, make some smaller, but then if I want to scale the whole thing up that I've created, right, I can proportionally scale all of those faces using the scale tool. If I want to rotate, I click on the rotate tool, and this ball comes up that has 3 color bands and then this darker circle. The darker circle means it's going to rotate within the plane that's parallel to the view from the camera, if that makes sense. Like, it's what the camera is facing. And so it'll sort of rotate in all 3 dimensions. And again, that's kind of messy usually. But if you want to isolate it in a single direction, then you just hover over one of these bands until it highlights, and you click and drag to rotate. Now, if you want to do this more precisely, you can hold Shift, and it will pop it within 5-degree increments, which makes it pretty easy to do, say, like a 45-degree angle or 90 degrees, or, you know, whatever you need to do. And so, you know, you can go ahead and experiment with this a bit, you know, rotate your object in a few different directions, right? So this is how we rotate things. If you've really messed things up and you've rotated it in some horrible direction or moved it someplace you didn't mean to, and you want it to go back to the origin, there's this option right up here that just says PSR, and it's reset the position, scale, and rotation. And what this will do is reset everything back to the way it was. Now, it's not going to reset the scaling that I did with these orange dots, right? Those are separate and they control a different attribute. And we'll talk about that in a second. So the last thing we need to talk about in this tutorial is what happens in here now that we've got an object in the object hierarchy, and then a couple more attribute tools here. So anytime I select a tool up here, like say the move tool, when I do that, the attributes for the tool show up here. If I then click on my object, dang it, I should have turned off my notifications. So sorry about that little ding that you just heard. So if I click on the object, then the object attributes show up. And you can see that when I'm been manipulating these orange dots, my size in either my Y, Z, or X dimension changes. And I believe in the next tutorial, I'm going to get a bit more into manipulating things through here, but I just wanted to show you that that's where your attributes show up. And again, there's several different tabs. The object manager, or sorry, the objects hierarchy here shows the objects in my scene, right? I created that cube. Now there's a cube in the scene. If I was to come back up here, click, and then drag to create a torus, now I have a torus and a cube, right? And if I was to create more objects, those other objects would continue to be added to the scene and added to the hierarchy. When I'm selecting objects, I can either do it in the window, or I can come up here in the hierarchy and I can click on the name of the object to select it. Okay, so I believe that's a pretty good overview of this interface, and we will continue with the next tutorial, which shows you how to use primitives.